Hello, Alison.
Hello, Guy. How are you doing?
I'm cold, hence the hat
Oh,
and the beanie and the stove's going and the heater's going, and I periodically turn the jug on. But that's okay. I chose to come to the east coast of Tasmania towards in autumn, so that's I'll be responsible for that. Alison, we're going to have a conversation about Vita,
hmm
and I've been sharing Vita with you and explaining what I've been working on over the last few years. And could you could you give me your understanding of Vita?
That's not an easy question to start with. Yeah, so yeah, you and I have been talking about this since before you actually had that idea, and you were writing all sorts of books about gloomers as opposed to doomers.
Nice.
Now,
Thank
my understanding of Vita is that it's not a religion as we understand religions to be. So it's something that has some attributes that are a little bit like spirituality and spiritualism. And I think of it as religion light, in that it doesn't require you to invest in particular views about a spiritual entity, for example. But what it does try to do is foster a deeper connection with nature. So that's my understanding, and that it's a kind of manifesto for how we can all live together and share a respect for nature. So that's kind of that's my superficial understanding of it.
Well, that's even better than my understanding of it. So I'm going to go with yours. So the way I frame it is it's a spiritual philosophy, and a spiritual philosophy has got two words: spiritual and philosophy. So spiritual relates doesn't it's not easy to define spiritual, but it's an umbrella concept that brings in to question things like the big answers to the big questions of life. Where did we come from? Where are we going? What happens when we die? What is our purpose on the planet? That's part of it. And then peak experience. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff. So I refer to Vita as a spiritual philosophy, and is basically just trying to answer all of those questions. And you can answer those questions, most of those questions, by referring to science. If you want to know where did we come from, you talk to biologists. If you want to know where did the Earth come from, you talk to cosmologists and geologists, right? So most of those big questions can be answered using the scientific frame, but then some of those questions are basically just left unanswerable questions, such as what happens when we die, in which case we've just got to create a story about that helps us get through the Anthropocene crisis, and ultimately, hopefully, humans can one day actually be in synergy with nature, that we can actually flourish together. And most of the spiritual philosophies that you've got out there at the moment simply aren't suited to that task. And so that's really what I'm trying to do, is to try and create a body of knowledge around spirituality that helps to advance that cause. That's my way. So between what you said and what I said, I guess most people should go, oh, I kind of get it. I think I understand what's going on. And fundamentally, there is a sort of a central premise in there that all the living things on the planet are basically part of a single being, in a way. Sort of like James Lovelock said that the living things on Earth behave in the manner of a living organism, where Vita is sort of taking a step further and sort of saying that there is a supernatural, and that supernatural is actually the living planet of which we are cells in the body. That's really what it's all about. So now the question, and fundamentally what we're trying to do with Vita is to, as you're pointing out, is to help people connect emotionally and spiritually with nature. And that comes back to a question that we've had about ecophany, the idea of an environmental awakening. Did you have an environmental awakening?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I didn't recognize it as being a kind of awakening when it happened, because I was so immersed in what felt to me like the most intense cataclysmic experience that I'd ever had. And I still remember when it happened. It was just quite bizarre.
Can you describe
so
that?
Yeah, so I mean, in the lead up to this event, I'd been immersing myself in the literature on climate change and the climate breakdown. And as you know, I mean, I have a PhD in psychology, so I consider myself to be not unintelligent, but I didn't I didn't get how bad things were. I really didn't get how bad things were. And what happened to me is something that Roger Hallam actually describes as, when he in some of his interviews, when he talks with people, he says, you know, you're describing the situation, but you're not feeling it.
Yeah.
And so what I was doing was simply reading the facts and hearing how bad things were, but I hadn't actually felt it. And then when I did feel it, and it was an intense experience, it was almost as if all of my senses somehow sort of fused around this experience. And I've recently been looking at or revisiting some work by Steve Taylor. And Steve Taylor is a psychologist who works in the UK. And his area of research is specifically on spiritual awakenings and what they are. Okay. And the way he describes it kind of resonates with what happened to me. So he describes it as the ego lifts, the ego vacates the room, and that then creates a space for this enlightened other to then inhabit that space. And that's kind of what happened to me. So it was almost as if I became one with everything around me. It's very hard to describe something that has so many different complex attributes.
Yeah. And how?
So that's what happened. And the key thing about it for me is that it's been irreversible. It's completely changed how I feel and how I see my connection.
How long ago was this?
So this would have been about 3 years ago now. Yeah.
So prior to 3 years, you sort of knew a bit about like the ecosystem and like climate and stuff, and that. But when you started to drill down and to understand it, there's a point at which you had like that aha moment, and you saw that you were a part of it as opposed to apart from it.
Yeah, exactly. And the key thing about that was to really feel it and to experience it.
Yeah.
So, and that's not the same as simply reading something. It's not the same as reading a text which says we're all a part of nature. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so what you're describing there is what in Vita we refer to as ecophany, an ecological epiphany, all right? And it's simply that an awakening. But I think what you've suggested is that these awakenings, they're not reversible. The point is that when you wake up to something, you can't go back to sleep again about it. You know?
Exactly. You can't unsee it. You can't unknow it. Yeah.
And if you're self-empowered and you have that awakening, then you can change your circumstances in order to be a part of that solution, which is really, I mean, you left academia to become effectively a climate activist. Really.
That's right. That's right. I once I'd had this awakening, it completely changed how I viewed my career, how I viewed myself, how I viewed what I was doing, and it just made it impossible for me to continue with a career because the goals that I'd had previously were somehow no longer relevant.
Yeah.
And that could have been quite catastrophic actually, to realize that everything you've been doing for the past 20 or 30 years is actually, apart from having my children, of course, but that realization that all of that was actually really irrelevant, that it had been futile, that I'd been focused on completely the wrong things.
Yeah.
It could have been catastrophic. It wasn't, because for me it was very motivating. It's kind of really energized me. And it's very important to note also that I'm very aware that being able to leave my job was kind of an exercise in privilege. Not everyone can do that. Sure. I get that. Yeah.
And what was your job? You were senior in academic circles. What was your role?
I was what's called a pro vice chancellor at a university. So I was basically running a university.
Yeah.
And
which university?
Yeah. So I had a sorry.
Which university was that?
I was running Arden University, which is a new university in the Midlands in the UK. Okay. And that was a job I loved, and I had lovely colleagues. I really enjoyed it. But not looking at Arden in particular, but just looking at the sector as a whole, it just seemed to me that what academia is doing is gearing young people up for a future that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So that future future, you know, it might have been relevant 10, 20 years ago, but as of now, you know, and I give examples of courses in you know, classical economics, or even worse, petroleum engineering, and we should not be encouraging young people to go into careers which will be obsolete in a few years' time.
Yeah,
we hope.
irrespective of your ideology, they're probably simply not going to be
Exactly.
there with the economic forces. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so back to this, help me with your language, and somebody who, and what was your thesis in your psychology PhD?
Oh, so my background's in cognitive psychology. So my area of expertise, if you like, is expertise itself. It's how people learn and how people become skilled and how they become experts. And I, you know, when I started out, my grand vision was to try to understand how to enable people to learn quickly.
Right.
Because I saw that as being something that would benefit humanity, and that's what I wanted to do.
Yeah. I'm going through a master's at the moment. I mentioned this the other day when we spoke, and I took one of my courses and did a research project. And the research project was really about how to have people, how to foster ecophany, the emotional and spiritual awakening that you had. How do we do that? And what I found was really difficult was, as I'm sitting there with the course convener trying to explain what I wanted to do in this paper that I was going to write, he kept saying, well, you need to specify the learning outcomes. You need to specify the learning outcomes. And I got to a point where I'm like, my brain was starting to spark. And I said, dude, you're missing the point. I'm trying to foster feeling outcomes. Okay. So in a way, your life has pivoted in a way because of something you felt, not because of something you learned, right? And this exactly. is the literature that I'm reading, particularly, for example, Scott Atran, whose work on devoted actor theory, is saying that feelings, or particularly spirituality and answers to these big questions, and where do you connect to the bigger picture, are bigger drivers of behavior or behavioral change, if you like, than are cognitive and learning new information. Right? If you get more information about how the oppressor has oppressed you, that doesn't make you more willing to take costly sacrifices to go and fight the oppressor. But if you can actually fuse the idea of the oppressor as being wrong as a sacred value, then all of a sudden you've got a soldier. And so this is something I've been sort of finding my way through over the last few years, trying to figure out how to use that body of knowledge, if you like, the body of knowledge about inciting feelings, to basically rise an army of environmentalists. I'm not talking about an army with weapons. I'm talking about people that are going to go that extra distance and change their lives to actually be a part of this thing. Yeah. So what have you got to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that there are a number of points that I'd kind of make about that. I mean, one, I think it's really important that people don't feel that you have to have some kind of spiritual awakening or ecophany in order to want to take action with regard to the climate and ecological crisis. So, but I think what you're suggesting is much more inclusive than that. And if you look at the research, so for example, you know, I listen to Catherine Hayhoe a lot because she's a fantastic scientist, and B, an amazing communicator. And one of the key things that she highlights in her talks is that it's really important to find some way to bond with a person when you talk about the climate and ecological crisis. So you've got to find some sort of shared common ground, and that might be, you might want to talk about your family or the local environment, or spirituality, you know, a shared faith, something like that. So I think what you're talking about is consistent with what she's saying, which is finding ways that we can connect, you know, whatever that might be, and certainly having shared beliefs and views about nature would be one way of doing that. But I think also there's a kind of tension here, isn't there? Because ecophany, my experience of it was kind of negative initially, because it was really quite scary. And if you look at the work of Tali Sharot, who's a neuroscientist, and one of the things she talks about is how the brain is hardwired to prefer optimistic outcomes.
Yeah.
So in a sense, the issue, I think, for you and what you're doing is for it to be seen as a positive thing. But to get to that positive place, you might have to go through an uncomfortable experience. Because I have to say, for me, it was really uncomfortable. And for some people, you know, when you're in that immersive space where you suddenly realize how bad everything is, and you get that sense of connection that you have with it all. Some people might, you know, you have a fear or flight response. Some people might be so scared of that they back off. They don't want to go into it, don't want to face it. So I think there has to be, you know, you have to talk about the positives about going through that process, because that's what people will be invited to do, to go through this process of ecophany, to then come out the other end, and to have that shared understanding with others that, you know, we're a part of it all, not apart from it all.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And so, I mean, there's a battle that goes on amongst environmentalists fundamentally as to whether you should tell the truth about the nature of the global crisis, right? Because when you start telling the truth, you've got to start dealing with some really, really grim potential scenarios. And so for me, yeah, sure, you got to tell the truth. The term that I came across in my studies was the Cassandra effect, which is basically this psychological predisposition not to hear bad news or to disbelieve bad news.
Exactly. And that's where Catherine Hayhoe comes in again, because she talks about this negative feedback loop where you know, you hear the bad news and then people just freeze and they don't want to do anything. And so they don't. It leads to inaction. And so what she's suggesting is that you break that cycle by connection. So you talk to someone about, well, I'm really worried about what's going on. And then you connect with that person, and it's the connection that then enables them to hear. And then you start to talk to them. Well, what can we do? You know, what can we do about it? And then you kind of get into this feedback loop where people are actually taking action.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking also is that there was, I can't remember the context, but there was this idea that quite often what people fear is the sort of unknown aspect. Whereas when you actually start learning and getting some facts and figures and getting a sort of a sense of how the landscape lies, then whilst you're actually looking at more of the factual data, the unknown goes away. So a lot of the fear goes away as you learn. And I think, and also with respect to this sort of positive story, I mean, the way that I see it, and this is what I understand from reading the science papers and talking to the people that are across the contemporary science, is that no matter what we do as a civilization now, we're going into decades of degrading environmental conditions, and we're going to lose landscapes and species and cities and, you know, lots and lots of people. So, I mean, that's irrespective of how rapidly we turn the ship around because of what's baked in and because of the heating that's already built into the system. And so the positive story for me is the idea of what we can potentially learn from this as a civilization coming through on the other side. And this is the concept of the Verdant Age. And the Verdant Age is really what happens after, or what could happen after, after all this thing washes up, right? And there's an astrophysicist called Adam Frank who wrote a book called Light of the Stars, and he did some sums in there in which he calculates that it's hundreds of trillions of civilizations in the universe. And he says that probably most of them go extinct because of the same reasons that we're going extinct. But he says that there's probably a quarter of them would survive. And the ones that survive are the ones that develop a synergistic relationship with their biospheres. So if you go and look at the research around that, you just come across the Ecozoic era is the name given to this synergistic relationship. There's a concept called Gaia 2.0. The Trajectories science paper in 2018 talked about stewardship of the whole Earth system. So here's a scientific frame that could apply to this optimistic scenario for the future of humanity. And part of the reason why I think that's really important is because I've been around the conversation of sustainability for over 20 years. And I'm getting sick of hearing people talking about what happens at 2100, as if at 2100 it's lights out, or as if there's actually nothing beyond 2100. And so what I'm saying is that we have got the possibility of living on this planet for tens or hundreds of millions of years into the future, if only we can order our societies with respect to the biosphere. And so for me, that's something that fills a part of my, I don't like using the term, but it's the term everyone uses, that fills a part of my soul, that's the motivation for me to be here. That's why I'm here, is to help advance the verdant age. And you see, so I guess in a way, trying to take, go on, sorry.
No, it's fine. It's fine. It's interesting because, you know, the way as I see it, we are embarking on an era of great uncertainty, of precarity, and we don't know when it will end. And so, you know, 2100 is sufficiently distant in terms of you know, in terms of time, but it's psychologically distant as well. And, you know, as humans, I think we tend to think in terms of a journey. You know, we're going somewhere and we will get to a particular point and then things will be settled. And it's much harder for us to think, well, actually, this is now a journey where we don't know when things will stabilize. We don't know how bad things are going to get. And that is going to be an incredible test for humanity, because, you know, coping with uncertainty is one of the things that humans find incredibly difficult. So it will, you know, it will test each of us in terms of our resources, because we each differ in terms of how well we can cope with uncertainty. So I think there's that angle to it. But there's another interesting angle too for me, and that is, you know, are we going to become, you know, are we going to, I mean, we're already tribal. There are already numerous tribes. You know, there are the tribes of us who kind of get what's happening and who are part of the activist movement or the environmental movement, and like you, have been in it for decades. And there are some people who really don't have much interest in that. And so for me, there's a question around whether we can kind of coexist with those of us who are awakened and who profoundly care and who get it. And then those people who, for whatever reason, just choose not to go down that route and who want to continue to have a more distant relationship. So, and I'm interested in how that will pan out in the future. You know, that a utopian vision would be that we all, as you say, that we all learn how to live harmoniously within, you know, as stewards of the planet. You know, and that we get that it's a planet of finite resources, and we get that that, you know, that we are a part of that system, that, you know, that we're not above it. And I would love to think that humanity could get there, but I don't know. I don't know.
Okay, so that's a really good question, and you know, there's a proportion of the people that get that enlightenment about how things really are and our relationship to nature, and then there's the rest of the people that don't, right? So going back to this sort of some of the numbers that underpinned the Extinction Rebellion ideas, that you need only a certain proportion of the public to be actively involved in a non-violent rebellion in order to actually see the success. So we've did some modeling, relatively simple modeling, to try and estimate. See, the thing about Vita is I haven't invented anything so much as put a name to something. All right. So there's already a whole bunch of people out there that have had that ecophany, or for whatever reason, they identify as themselves as a part of nature. And so what I've just tried to do is to try and create some structure around that thing that already existed, and put some names to things that didn't have a name. We were asked once how many Vitans were there, and of course there's not many Vitans because it's relatively new. But we looked, I've been reading about the cultural creatives. And so there's a psychographic, there's some work by some American researchers that identify Western people as falling broadly into three classes, depending on how they see the world. And they talk about the conservatives, who really are harking to an earlier time, the moderns, who make up about 55% of the public, who kind of just pretty comfortable with the way things are. They know how to get by. And then you've got the cultural creatives that make up about 35% of the public, and who are really kind of striving to make things better and see opportunities for improvements in environment and, you know, gender issues and so forth. Well, so we estimate that a quarter of the cultural creatives would identify as vegan if the information put before them in a compelling manner. That's about 8% of the public in the Western world, adult public.
Yeah, okay, but it's always really important to remind ourselves that because Western society is what we're used to. If we think about the global South in particular and Indigenous people, it'd be really interesting to see how many of them would identify with what some of the things that you're talking about.
Well, yeah, that's right. And so I've focused my numbers and my languaging and communications around the Western people because I'm a Western person and I can't properly speak for people that come from other cultural backgrounds. So I don't know how people of, for example, Chinese descent would relate to these ideas, although I'm sure a lot of them would do, because this is basically a modern form of Taoism in a way, sort of identifying, the flow of nature and so forth. So my languaging is all around Western people, and also Western people have a lot in common with each other, of course. I mean, when I say Western, I'm talking about Japanese people and French people and English people and Americans and New Zealanders, like modern industrial societies, who are all kind of tending in the same direction of the consumeristic sort of model.
Well, we're the problem, exactly. We're the problem in this.
That's the other thing as well. In terms of consumption, in terms of greenhouse emissions, that's actually the group that are doing most of the problem. Yeah. And you might say, well, what about all of those people in the South that are cutting down the forest? Well, somebody's buying those forests. Somebody's paying for those forests to be cut down. So, and also, look, it's in the early days of explaining this idea, it's much easier to explain it if we just keep it focused on like the Western folk. And although lots of other people, like for example, what I refer to in Vita as Vitae Planeta, which is like the idea of the living planet, of the single system, is what is referred to as Pachamama by South American tribes, or Gaia by some scientific communities, or Mother Nature, or some. And so many different cultures, and particularly indigenous cultures, would have their own name for this thing. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find languaging that will appeal to Western people, create its own unique identity, even though it's basically the same thing as Pachamama, Mother Gaia, and so forth. And one of the problems is that whilst there's nothing fundamentally new in Vita except for maybe the arrangement, it's sort of like picking out beads and stringing them on a necklace. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a way that we can get this idea, the idea that we're all part of nature and we should protect it, to make it popular and funky, and ultimately make it spread really rapidly. And so that's, again, so this idea of fostering ecophany, or helping people have that ecophany. And then if we can figure out the tools, then conceivably we can figure out how to do that on a mass scale and get hundreds of millions of people to have that awakening. And that awakening hopefully then will change their behavior, which will then fundamentally shift the relationship, politics and power, and where governments spend their money and so forth and so on. So sort of, I guess I'm sort of coming at the Extinction Rebellion model, if you like, but from the spiritual angle, rather than instructing people what to do, sort of trying to get them to feel the right thing, which will then inform their actions. That's the idea behind it, anyway. Yeah,
and I think it's good to have something that is a starting point for people to start having a conversation. So, much as I love Extinction Rebellion and my friends and so forth in that movement, I think for some people it was a big ask to ask people to relinquish their freedom and to get arrested. And as Gail was arrested yesterday, and some people understandably find that really scary. That they might be arrested, that they might actually be put in jail. So I think that the percentage of people who might actually be willing to do that is always necessarily going to be quite small. But going back to your point, and to Catherine Hayhoe's point as well, if we could find ways to connect, one-to-one initially, so that each of us are starting to have those conversations and bonding with each other around a conversation about, what's happening locally to us. So, so here in Cambridge, for example, this year the growing season seems to be a little bit behind last year. I'm hoping that we don't have another extreme summer where we see, you know, die off of trees and so forth. But those are the kinds of talking points.
Yeah.
You know, you talk to your neighbour and say, I'm really worried because my tree is dying and this hasn't happened before. Or, you know, you get a hailstorm in May, you know, that kind of thing. Rising sea levels, you know, if you're living in the coast in Norfolk, you know, you might find that you can't sell your house because it's at risk of falling into the sea. In Australia, you know, you might find you're kind of a bit stuck because there are forest fires, you know, regular forest fires, and you can't move. Or in North California, it's the same kind of thing. And so to me, it seems that those kinds of real threats that we feel in our vicinity might be the ways to start having that conversation, and to get people to start thinking that actually what we're doing is causing this stuff to happen.
No, that's actually a really good point. I mean, and it's now, I mean, the changes in the climate and the global ecosystem are now so abundant that pretty much you go anywhere, anybody that's got half the head screwed on will know that there's things happening that really shouldn't be happening or hadn't happened or more frequently. And those fires that we had in Australia a year and a half ago, I was actually down in, I'm in Tasmania now, but I was over in Western Tasmania a little while ago. And they had fires there in places that hadn't burned in thousands of years. That was really surprising. It was on the edge of the sort of wet rainforests. Now, something else that we talked about the other day, and maybe we'll just use this as a final discussion point, is the whale strandings. So I was in the town called Strahan, and Strahan was the sort of epicenter of a mass stranding of pilot whales in last September. There was around 500 whales washed up on the beach. So Strahan's on the inside of, or on the shores of Macquarie Harbour, which is this massive, basically an inland sea, which is connected to the sea through this very narrow channel, which is about 30 meters wide, where many of the whales swam into the harbour. And the harbour is really shallow. It's only about 17 meters deep. And this is an oceanic creature, these pilot whales. So many of the whales washed up on the coastal beach on the outside, but many of them came into the harbour and washed up on the sandbanks. But either way, they were in big trouble. And of the around 500, I think about 380 died. I mean, this is a huge, I mean, there's a lot of animals. I mean, each of these animals is like 5-6 meters long, you know, and hundreds of them. But when the whales came ashore, the locals all rushed down and spent a week waiting around in the cold water. This is September, like I'm freezing my bum off, and it's, you know, it's only May, so I could just imagine how cold it was in Western Tasmania in September. And so there's something innate. I think this is a really important thing I want to get to and get your views on it, is that there is something innate in humans that connects us to nature, and all we've got to do is uncover it, right? It's already there. It's not like we have to build something that doesn't exist. But what happens is when we're born and we start listening to the conversations, in our culture, layers upon layer of Western culture, which is inert to nature, is that we get our nature-loving part of us, that nature-based spirituality, which is inherent to us all, basically gets covered up. And so what Vita is trying to do is to try and peel away those onion layers to let free something that is already there. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. And it, you know, the whale example is just unbelievably moving. It's heartrending. And when we spoke, you know, I mentioned the example of the mother whale about a year or so ago who carried her dead calf for weeks. I mean, I found that so moving, distressing.
That was a pilot whale.
I cried.
That was the same type of
and then just yesterday, you know, there was a young minke whale had swam up the Thames, and there were attempts to rescue it. And as I was watching the news, they actually announced that they'd had to euthanize it, and I cried. You know, I cried because I was so distressed about that poor creature. And I think for me, it's you know, that is a reminder that was it was a reminder that there was another creature that was lost. You know, it was lost in a place it shouldn't have been, and it was in severe distress. And you know, that's an expression of empathy. So I was able to empathize with that whale and with the female whale who'd lost her calf. And I think that when we're actually brought into direct contact with suffering, then it elicits in us that, you know, those feelings of empathy, because we recognize that another creature is struggling.
Yes.
And, you know, and that is a key part of what it is to be human. You know, we can empathize.
Yeah.
And I think it's the start of a process where we kind of start to understand that, you know, we kind of see ourselves as being the top of the pile in terms of, you know, our ability to reason and to be educated and so forth. And yet, and there are so many studies that come out that show, you know what, actually, we're not quite as unique as we would like to think. And so there are, you know, the communication that exists with other species is just phenomenal, and we don't understand it and need to. And then those kind of sophisticated communities that cetaceans have are far more sophisticated than we've ever really appreciated and understood. And even when, you know, the stories that, or not stories, the research articles that come out that look at the trees and networks of trees and how they adjust to each other, you know, they accommodate to each other, they adapt. And all of that suggests that, you know, that we're not really as special and unique as we like to think.
Mm.
And so for me, those kinds of learnings are really important in us seeing our place, not at the top of the stack, but being part of this incredibly sophisticated and beautiful system. You know, and I just wish that everyone could get how fantastically beautiful and amazing it is. Because I feel that if we all understood that, why would you want to harm it?
Yeah. Just a thought occurred to me. I was in Hervey Bay, which is in sort of central Queensland some months ago. And there's a big whale watching industry. You've got Fraser Island, and then you've got this big bay, Hervey Bay, and the whales come in, and I think they actually drop the calves in the bay. But anyway, a lot of humpback whales come into Hervey Bay, and it's really flat water, so it's ideal to. Anyway, it was quite funny. There's this big wooden decking there next to the harbour where the whale watching boats go out. And there's a great big red Sven Foyn gun, which is one of the harpoon guns that they used to use, because before they had the tourism, they were shooting the whale in the harbour. And there was these European backpackers were like getting photographs next to this gun. And I said, do you know what that is? And I think she's Italian, the girl, she said, oh, no, what is this? And I explained it to her, and I showed her the harpoon at the end with the exploding grenade.
Yeah.
Like, oh, but the thought that I had as you were telling that story was that people have some sort of an emotional response about whales on a whale watching tour, right? That is a very different response that they have when it's stranded on a beach. And this is really important. It's not just the whale, it's the suffering of the whale that really triggers people. It's when they see the whale, and also this irony that we blindly chop our way through millions of cattle every year, and abattoirs and steaks and hamburgers. Nobody really fundamentally bats an eyelid over that, but you throw one minke whale on the beach and everyone's crying on the shore, right? And so maybe it's something to do with the fact that the cows were sort of not natural in that environment. It's not like cows were a wild animal that we've tracked down. We grew them specifically, right? We husbanded them. Whereas the whale washes up, that's a piece of nature. So there's some interesting sort of psychology in there. And I really think that stranded whales is a pathway to ecophany. So somehow people that have been involved in the whale stranding but never had a proper frame of reference for it could be given that frame of reference. And also maybe when there is a whale stranding, maybe it's possible to get a whole bunch of people together on the periphery, not to interfere with the action so much, but to see if you can't actually spread that sentiment around a broader number of people. Anyway, so there's just some ideas that I'm playing with here, but fostering mass ecophany, fostering millions of people to have a spiritual awakening to nature is fundamentally, I think, something that's as important as renewable energy or, you know, pumped storage or, you know, all of the other potential proposed solutions to the climate crisis. Okay, cool.
Okay.
Thanks for that. You've got a day to go to. I've got an evening to go to. Thank you, Alison.
And thanks, Guy. Always an interesting discussion, and good luck with everything you're doing.
Thank you. And I'll talk to you in a little while, okay?
Sure.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.